Hello everybody and welcome to this 12th chapter in your Java EE7 tutorial series. This chapter will introduce manage beans, its method and properties that can be used by JSF, and it also introduces the bean validation feature that we talked about before in previous chapters, and we are now finally programming the server side. So the first thing you want to talk about is manage beans. So manage beans are Java beans tasked with validating a component's data, handling an event fired by a component, or performing processing to determine the next page to which the application must navigate. So manage beans are set using code like this. So first you set a property like user number, and then you use a set method to set the the property, and you use a get method to get the property from the managed bean. You can also use EL in managed bean to use the benefits of deferred evaluation, to be able to read and write data, and to use the method expressions that we've talked about in previous chapters. Let's take a look at this example where this tag binds the input guess component of the value to the user number bean dot user number. This managed bean is properties using an I value, as talked about in the previous chapter, and it uses the get method of the validate number range, which gets the validation of this number. Now let's take a look at writing bean properties. So to write a managed bean property that is bound to a component's value, they must both match property types. What I mean by that is you have your component classes over here, and if you want to talk about booleans, you use the UI select boolean. If you want to talk about primitive and numeric types, you use the UI input, output, select item, or select one. What I mean is if you're using anything, you have to make sure that it's basically paired with the component class that you want to use. So to get an example of what I'm talking about, let's take the UI input and output tag example. So here you can see that you have your EL, so your expression language, which is getting the name property from your cashier bean manage bean. So then what this does is it goes inside your manage bean, and inside the manage bean of cashier bean you have your property called name, and it has a set method which is called set, and it has a get method which is get name. So what this does is it sets the whatever you input into this text box, it sets that using this set name method. If you want to get the name, then you use the get name method. Now this is one example of the multiple examples that I showed over here. This is just the input and output version, but there's so many more for the UI data and the UI select boolean. Now that you get the gist of what I'm saying, let's move on to writing properties bound to component instances. Now let's take a look at this code over here. We have a little checkbox and we have a little output label next to our checkbox. What this does is it tells us that our checkbox is not rendered yet, and the output label next to the checkbox is also not rendered. Now these two are bound to the cashier bean's special offer, special offer managed bean property, and the special offer text property. Now if we go to our managed bean, you can see that our special offer text is UI output. Because it's part of the text output, it's a string, so it has to be UI output, and UI select boolean for the special offer, since it can only be true or false. Now if the user buys more than $100 worth of books, which will set the rendered value to true, so in this case it's false, but it will turn to true if the user buys more than $100 worth of books. It will show up like, would you like to join the fan club, and you can check yes or no for that. So then there's writing properties bound to converters, listeners, and validators. The usefulness of using managed beans to dynamically validate, over here you can see that it validates dynamically because it uses EL, and it's saying use the convert date property from the login bean managed bean. So the usefulness of this, if we go to our managed bean, you can see that it says set convert date, and it uses a set pattern, and then you use that set pattern later on in your facelet. So the usefulness of this is that you can dynamically validate and change the validation rules in a manage bean instead of having to go to every single facelet page and changing it there. Now let's look at writing managed beans methods. So there are 4 ways to write managed bean methods. First, you can handle navigation, or you can handle actions, you could perform navigation, and you can handle value change. So first of all, handling navigation. There is the action method, which is a managed bean method that handles navigation processing, and it's like in another it's in a it's facelet, but we'll see it later. Inside our managed bean, you'll see this method called submit, and what this does is it actually it does 2 things. It either, if it checks if the cart total is greater than 100 and it's not the special offer is not rendered, then it will set the rendered things to true, which you saw before. It set it to true, and then it will return null. Returning null really just reloads the page with the same data. And then else if the special offer is rendered, right, and the thank you is not rendered, then it will set the thank you to render. So it will say thank you for your offer, and then it reloads it again. And then if all of this has already been done, then it goes all the way to clearing the cart and returning a book receipt. So what this does is it returns a string called book receipt, which puts it in the URL, and then inside the URL it will run, and then you'll go to a completely different page. Then you can also use, for example, occasionally you can use enums in some occasions. So for example, in this case, instead of returning a string, you could also use an enum called navigation, and you can call this enum using this dot parameter, and then you can use account hist. Then there's writing a method to handle an action event. Now, this one is actually a bit more simpler than what I explained. Handling an action event is usually referenced to a component's action listener attribute. So over here, you can see that this method gets the component that is generated the event from the event object. Then it gets the component's ID, which is a code for the book. The method matches the code against a hash map, which is over here, and that contains the book's codes and corresponding book ID values. Finally, the method sets the book ID by using the select value from the hash map object. So rehash again. So it gets the ID of the book, and then it gets what ID corresponds with the book, and then it matches that ID with that book right there. Then there's writing a method to perform navigation. Now in this block of code, you can see that instead of implementing the java x.faces.validator, you can create a method in a managed bean that takes care of the validation of the component for you. In this validation here, it performs 2 different validations. If the user runs out of the number of guesses, you can see over here remaining guesses if it's less than or equal to 0, the method sets the valid property of the UI input component to false. Then it queues a message onto the faces context instance, associating the message with the content ID and returns. So it tells you that if you don't have any remaining guesses left, it then sets the UI input to validate to false, and it tells you no guesses are left. It also checks if your input has it's like less than or greater than what it's supposed to be, then it will say invalid guess, and then it will also set the validation to false. Now finally, there's writing a method to handle a value change event. Here you've seen this way of registering a value change listener onto the input text name. See over here. We can change this to utilize a managed bean method to listen for a change. Now, in a managed bean, you would have this code right here, which tells us to process the value change, and it takes an event, and then it gets all the stuff, and it gets the event that's associated with the key name. You can now change this by using the ID name and size 30, and then you can go for cashier bean.process value change, which calls this directly. The usefulness of this was that instead of doing the validation here inside this code right here, you can rather do it in a managed bean and then use this managed bean for multiple validations later on. And that's it. That's everything there is about our developing with a JSF Tech. So I hope you understood why we need to use managed beans, its method and properties that can be used by JSF, and we can understand how validation can be better used when we use managed beans. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.